It's often said that it would take a disaster of some kind with AGI in order to get people to truly understand that there might be downsides to it. People use the analogy of a Pearl Harbor for AGI or a Sputnik moment for AGI. I'm going to go through an argument for why many AGI disasters would actually accelerate an arms race and not slow it down. I'm going to throw two different little charts up on screen and kind of walk through how I see this situation in terms of the risks or hate to say benefits of a kind of minor mishap with AGI that ends up being dangerous. And at the end, I'll kind of draw what I currently consider to be kind of the core conclusion between if an AGI or early stage strong AI sort of disaster occurs, will it be a net positive for global solidarity, or will it be a divider? So I think about this as uniting or dividing AI disasters. And so there's a full article on this. I'll make sure it's linked. We'll walk through the two charts, talk about kind of the core distinction, and sort of wrap up. So the basic idea is that a disaster that is uniting would bring sort of the great powers in particular, but we could say the nations of the world, but what matters most here is the great powers, the US and China, together to sort of think about, okay, how do we want to mitigate the downsides of this stuff, and maybe how do we want to think about a future that ends up being kind of positive for this stuff? That would be a uniting disaster. A dividing disaster would be one where both parties really ramp up capabilities and start racing against each other even harder than they already are right now. So we'll look at this first chart first. This is kind of the larger, more complicated one. So on the left-hand side here, we'll think about levels of disaster. So at the very top is world ending. So in this case, a world-ending disaster, whether it's the perceived cause of that disaster is a great power, a small group of humans, or self-aware AI itself, no matter who kind of kicked things off, if it's world-ending, then we're not recovering from it. That's over. So there's a whole swath of these disasters from which we do not recover. Then there's sort of, terrible scenarios, and then there are more moderate scenarios in terms of the level of disaster. And there's some listed down here in the graphic, right? But the great powers have a terrible AI disaster that might be AI-driven warfare between two or more great powers. A small human group, by the way, in this context, could be some kind of like a rogue, terrorist organization, maybe, buried away somewhere in the United States, maybe distributed and remote, maybe kind of a known terrorist organization, but certainly not like a country, not a nation. So if we think about a terrible example here, this might be a small group that uses AI-driven tech like bioweapons or explosives or whatever, and ends up killing millions of people through some AI systems that sort of kick out new agents to automate certain processes, and physical robots, maybe bioweapons, maybe whatever. And if it's self-aware AI itself, then maybe it's a terrible example of an AI disaster itself would be AI on its own, sort of overtaking businesses, governments, etc. And then moderate scale are just sort of a dialed down version of that. And the basic idea here is that uniting disasters would be most likely to kick off when we're talking about small human groups or self-aware AI. When those are the perceived cause and the disaster level is not world-ending, then there is a possibility that the great powers would handle it together, and then when the dust settled would say, okay, we need to make sure we get a grip on this. And would have some degree of solidarity to reduce risks and potentially promote upside in a more united global way, seeing how horribly dangerous this stuff could be. However, if the perceived cause of the disaster is the great powers, then it would accelerate the arms race dynamic. So if the US interprets some kind of a horrible incident around AI as coming ultimately from China, and there's maybe even consensus around that, or there's evidence about that, then that would cause an increased kind of enemizing of those two groups, and that would be more of a dividing disaster. That would be, okay, you want to attack us, well, we're going to ramp up and we're going to attack you. But notice, again, this bottom strata here is the perceived cause of the disaster. So in this case, it might be the case that it was actually a small random rogue terrorist group. It was not the U.S. funding this group to attack China. It was just a rogue group attacking China on their own. But if China perceives that we're connected enough to that group, or there could have been funding through the United States or compute provided by the United States, even if it's not correct, if China interprets it that way, or vice versa, then that would accelerate the arms race dynamic. So if the perceived cause is a great power enforcing its will somewhere in the world through this dangerous AI, then the other great power is going to ramp. If the perceived cause is some random rogue group or AI itself spinning up and doing horrible, dangerous things and killing people, then the great powers are likely to come together. Another way to think about this, in terms of like a more simple visual, is if we look across the two types of disasters, we could really basically see them as sort of like, are they human-directed or are they AI-directed? And are they uniting or are they dividing? So uniting disasters, if it is human-directed, it means it's coming from a small group. So if France does something horrible with AI to attack some other nation, extremely low likelihood, right? I mean, it's really, we're mostly talking about the great powers here. But if it were to be something like that, potentially China would see that as, this Western coalition wielding its might in the world, and China might want to build up. But if it's some arbitrary group of people, some hole-in-the-wall group in Bulgaria that somehow took over enough compute to spin up some stuff that could make some bioweapons or whatever, if that's the case, then that's more of a uniting disaster. And if it's AI-directed, then it's uniting if it's seen as AI going rogue unto itself. But if the sort of AI-directed accident was perceived as being a mask for actually tampering by the opposite party, then it would be dividing. So if it appeared that AI was going rogue in a bunch of automotive plants in China, but maybe the automotive plants themselves didn't want to admit that they had anything to do with it, they might say, well, we really think this could have been the Americans, or whatever the case may be, then it could be that would stoke the fire. So even if it was actually initiated by AI, if the sort of perception and the story spin made it be tension across the lines of great power, then it would be dividing. So people talk about, again, kind of like a Pearl Harbor for AGI being sort of what could get everybody to say, whoa, we really need to chill out and understand what's happening here. In my opinion, a Pearl Harbor would almost certainly lead to a dividing disaster, which is not really what we want. So I don't think we want disaster at all. It's a real shame to say that we may end up in a circumstance where, until the everyman sort of is walloped in some powerful way by this tech, just the citizenry will never care, and by consequence, the media and the politicians will never care, and so it just won't pop its way into common parlance. AGI risk will not pop its way into common parlance. We may need a disaster. We don't want one, but certainly if one were to occur, the goal would be for it to be uniting. And here's where I'll wrap it on just sort of like what I consider to be the core distinction. So the final distinction here, as far as I can tell, and sort of thinking about this and just kind of looking at historical precedents, and I put this on my mother here in terms of like what I consider to be the seed of this issue, would be the way that a disaster is responded to. So there's fundamentally only two ways. I think this is the key distinction. Number one, a disaster occurs, and the great powers, US and China, look at each other and they say, how could you do this? That's a dividing disaster. So if, however, the accident is perceived to be, whether it was actually decided to be conflict, an actual act of aggression of China versus the U.S. or vice versa, whether that was the case or not, if they look at each other and that's the posture, we're going to be ramping up even more horrible AGI risk. If instead they look at the issue, then they look at each other and they say, how are we going to deal with this? now we're talking about a uniting disaster. This is something that would bring about solidarity and potentially some coordination to decrease downside and increase upside for what AGI could be. So that I think, again, fundamentally is the distinction. So what that implies is that there's certain kinds of disasters we'd hope would happen more than others. Right? We would hope it'd be a rogue group, or we'd hope it'd be very clearly AI acting on its own and not a direct act of the great powers against each other. Similarly, though, what this implies is that there's grave danger and or opportunity in when a disaster occurs, ensuring that it's framed the right way. We could easily see some kind of an AGI lab in the United States have their own AI go rogue, people end up dying, right? Horrible things happen. And instead of saying, geez, we really dropped the ball here, Mr. President, instead they might say, I think China hacked us, right? So if the perception gets bent to make it a conflict across the great power lines, now we're headed towards war. And so we really want to downplay that. If it is a raw accident, if it's AI on its own, it's got to be labeled as such. If it's just a rogue group acting on their own, it's got to be labeled as such. So I think if a disaster must occur, or if one just happens to occur, I think that the framing the moment of will be absolutely crucial as to whether it's a moment for solidarity or not. Some people speak as if sort of like, yeah, we need a disaster for everybody to get on the same page. I think it's easily 50% of disasters could be spun to accelerate the arms race as opposed to slow it down. So I think that's a fundamental distinction. Hopefully that's useful. And that's really all I had for this video. So we'll wrap on that.